Good afternoon. Welcome back. We're going to start off with our second panel of today, political inclusion in the Middle East. We have an excellent panel. We have four outstanding scholars here, Bojina Wellborn, Abdussalam Maghrabi, Mazen Hassan, and Imad Salameh. We're going to go in this order, and I'm going to introduce first Bojina, and then continue with others later on in the panel. So Bojina teaches at Smith College in the U.S., is a contributing expert to the Women's Rights in the Middle East program at Rice University's Baker Institute. Her current research considers the impact of financial globalization on women's empowerment in the Middle East and North Africa. She is also a lead author on a forthcoming book, The Politics of the Headscarf in the United States, which showcases results from the largest academic survey of Muslim American women. And she's also the author of Business of Ballots, Financial Globalization and Women's Political Agency in the Arab World. Bojina? Yes.
So bear with me, I can't do this without my crib sheet. All right. Well, first of all, thank you to the Baker Center for hosting me. Thank you, Kadir. And I also want to send a shout out to Marwa Shalabi, who has been like my patron saint for the last few years whenever I've worked on this kind of research. So I'm going to risk sounding a little bit naive today because I'm going to talk about something that I think is slightly more positive, and I'm very curious to everybody's reception on it. So as you can see, my presentation today is entitled On Their Own, Women Running as Independents in the Middle East and North Africa. And this was actually galvanized by my research looking into the political economic effects of foreign capital on women's political inclusion. So I was really focused on this question of, foreign aid and aid conditionality and how it had essentially facilitated and even galvanized the embrace of gender quotas across a lot of countries in the Middle East and North Africa that, had donor agreements with countries in the West. But one of the things that really sort of confused this discussion at the time for me was the fact that I actually saw GCC countries also having women slowly being included into the political arena. And I was kind of curious about that because I was sort of thinking, well, they probably don't have the same kind of aid conditionality agreements. They don't have the same kind of dependencies that you see in a lot of North Africa and the Levant. So this sort of got me to thinking about the different ways that women actually access the political arena. So first of all, just to make sure you know, women do actually access the political arena. As you can see here, over the last 17 years, there has been a 300% increase in women's legislative representation in the Middle East and North Africa. So this is the single largest increase in women's legislative representation across the world, right? It's only been 97% in Africa, 86% in the Americas, and as we can see, only 7% in the Nordic countries. Now, for those of you who follow these statistics, you know that there's a really good reason for this. The Nordic countries are ahead of the game, right? They already have a lot of women in their parliaments. So it's not hard to have a 300% increase if you're starting from zero, right? And just to show you what that looks like, back in the day, in 2000, when the Interparliamentary Union actually surveyed regional averages for women's legislative participation across the single house, upper house of various sundry parliaments across the world, the Middle East and North Africa was definitely lagging behind, right, at some 3.6% on average. By the time we get to 2017, that percentage is basically, we're looking at 18%. And for the first time, you see the countries of Pacific Asia actually lagging behind the Middle East and North Africa. Now, to actually showcase this, and maybe a visual representation that's even more evocative, you can see from the table up here that over time we really see this huge increase in women's legislative representation. And what I'm really looking at here is women's legislative representation in the lower house. Most of the time the lower house is elected with a few appointments here and there. So this is really what I'm kind of focusing on. Most of you will also notice that a lot of these changes actually start happening in 2000. That coincides with the Millennium Development Goals, and it also coincides with this very global neoliberal shift towards gender empowerment. right? It also coincides with a push for gender quotas as a solution to how to include women into the political and social arena more actively. And the outcome of it is a sort of a very diverse array and quite substantial variation in women's legislative representation across the Middle East and North Africa. As you can see, we have countries that basically have less than 10% women's legislative representation in their our elected bodies. We have countries that have between 10 to 20%. Then we have countries that have over 20% as well. Now, most of the countries that have over 20% are countries that have gender quotas in place. To put a little bit of let's say a spin on this for you, countries such as Rwanda and also Sweden as well as Norway are also countries that have gender quotas too, which is one of the reasons why you see such high levels of women in their parliaments, right? Whenever you see 40 to 50% legislative representation for women in a parliament, you know that there's probably a 20 to 30% gender quota. So in many respects, the countries in that third bracket aren't that different from what you're seeing worldwide. Okay. So where all do we have gender quotas? Well, we have them all over the place. And the other thing you'll notice is that most of these gender quotas at the national level were adopted post-2000, right? So in line with the MDG goals. The other thing I will tell you is that after the Arab Spring in 2011, 3 or 4 of these countries also increased their gender quotas, right? They either doubled them or they adopted them for the first time. The other thing that really happens post-Arab Spring is we actually see a lot of countries starting to adopt municipal and local level gender quotas as well. So there's a real bid to potentially include a portion of the population that might be construed as restive as well. Now, the conventional wisdom when it comes to women's political inclusion worldwide, right? So this is not just restricted to the Middle East and North Africa, is really that what we're looking at is women gaining access through political spaces via political parties. In fact, whenever we think about women's participation in politics, it usually comes up. Now, why political parties? Well, first of all, because the assumption is that women are a disenfranchised group that they're marginalized from society, and they don't have the economic or the political or social reach to campaign on their own. So, political parties, right? They have the built-in networks, they have the funding, they have the resources. Women should be likely are going to be candidates through that experience. And we see that in North America as well as in the United States. The idea of a woman winning as an independent at the national level has hardly ever been broached. We do see it happen at the local level and at our local elections, but we don't necessarily see it. We certainly don't see it in the congressional elections or even see it at the presidential level. The other thing that we see is newly that women actually do gain access to political spaces through gender quotas. Now, the thing that's puzzling here is those of you who are students of the Middle East and North Africa know that the political party apparatus across the region isn't necessarily the most pronounced or the strongest, right? So there have to be other ways for women to gain access. Now, one of those ways is gender quotas, for sure. But what I was curious about was if there's something else here too. Are there other gateways to access formalized politics beyond political parties in the Middle East and North Africa? And essentially I started wondering, do women run as independents? Now, okay, to make a long story short, they do. Now, there are a couple of things going on in this particular slide that I want you to kind of pay attention to, right? So we see that a lot of the countries in this slide, and again, these are from the most recent elections, at least except for in the Kuwaiti case. One of the things we actually see here is that a lot of the countries are in the GCC. So I can see you shaking your heads, or you should be shaking your head because you're like, Baz, they're independent by default. They're banning political parties, right? There's no other way to run. And I'm going to tell you, I know, but hear me out, okay? All right, so the first thing we realize is that there's kind of a mix here, right? In the 6 countries we see here, and I'm just throwing in Saudi Arabia for giggles, right? Is that political parties are banned or circumscribed heavily in half of them, okay? The other thing that you're going to be noticing is that, most of them don't have gender quotas, 2 of them do. What I really want you to focus on is the electoral system. Pretty much all of these countries have some variant of plurality system, FTP, first past the post system, majoritarian system, or at least a parallel system, right? What does that mean? It means that we have elements of a PR system, a proportional system, system as well as a plurality system in place, which allows people to run as independents, but also allows them to run under the auspices of a political party. Okay? So, as you know, there's quite a diverse electoral arena in the Middle East and North Africa. In fact, we have pretty much every single possible example of electoral system in place. We can go back and forth as to whether they generate the kind of outcomes you want to see, but there's a lot of diversity here, which is kind of fascinating. The one thing I'll tell you, though, is that none of the countries that have like closed list PR systems or exclusively PR systems have women running as independents. One of the things I want to put to you here in our panel today is that in some respects that's pretty limiting, because if you have a parallel system in place, you have two ways for women to access politics. You have the opportunity for them to access it as independents, and you have the opportunity for them to access it through like political party structures. And we really see that especially in the cases of like Jordan and the case of Egypt. Now, why is this also kind of interesting? I'm not necessarily, again, this is not me telling you that these countries are necessarily more pluralistic or inclusive or democratic. I'm essentially rendering you aware of an interesting pattern that's emerged over time because of the diversity in electoral systems across the region, and this push to include women as well, both from the bottom up, but also from the responses from the top, from the push from the top down and responses from the bottom up. Now, probably one of the most fascinating things about this line of research that I've been exploring is that the Middle East and North Africa actually leads the world regionally in terms of the number of women who have been elected as independents. Right? And this happens even if we actually take out the cases of the GCC countries. So if you decide that, well, they're banning political parties in the GCC, this is really not a fair fight. But if I actually just turn this to like 3 states out of the 19 states that are listed in the region, according to the World Bank regional regional divisions, it's still a leading state when it comes to the number of women who can run as independents. Now, this is kind of interesting, right? Because most of you would probably be asking yourself the question of, in a region of the world where we keep thinking of women as disenfranchised, disempowered, where we have some of the lowest women's labor force participation rates, how is this possible? And are all of these women rich women? Well, to be honest, it depends. It's a mix, right? So there are a couple of things that are actually going on here. As you can see, electoral system makes a huge difference, right? You can't run without a political party in a system that's closed list PR. If it's closed list PR, you have to have party support. So you're not going to see any women running as independents. I will tell you one thing though, in North Africa, outside of the national level, if you actually look at the local level, especially in, let's say, the Moroccan case, at the local level elections, you do actually see some women win as independents, right? Because the system is not closed list and it's much more flexible. In fact, local level elections, most of the time you're more likely to see women running as independents because they tend not to necessarily be list PR or exclusively list PR. The other thing that we're seeing is that these are countries with weak party structures. Now, this is a blessing and a curse, right? It offers an opportunity for other types of agenda setting mechanisms and potentially for other types of, associations to enter the political fray, whether that be tribes, sects, social movements, or national and international NGOs like, kind of bankrolling one or the other. Right? So it's an alternative to political parties, or it's something in conjunction with political parties. And I would say that this is actually an interesting evolution in politics. Most of the women who run as independents, unsurprisingly, they're very, very well educated, right? In fact, they have higher educational levels than the norm, and very often they even have PhDs, which makes them more educated than their male counterparts. The other thing that's fascinating here is that a lot of the women's independents tend to use their own money, right, especially in the GCC countries. But what I've actually found in places like Oman and Jordan is that these women tend to also be in the education sector. So if they don't have money, what they use is essentially the social networks that they've built by virtue of working in education, by virtue of having kind of access to their communities and essentially having the trust of their communities. Finally, the presence of gender associations makes a difference. We've seen this in the Moroccan case at the local level, and district size makes a difference. It's easier for women to campaign in a smaller district. They don't have to travel as much. It's not as socially controversial. So I'll try to go through this quickly. I don't know how many minutes I have left.
About 3, 4.
Perfect. All right. So Why is this interesting in the GCC case? Well, first of all, it's because, well, yes, they're running without political party support, but again, I would argue that in the GCC, it's pretty hard to run as a woman for politics anyway, unless you have the executive behind you, and unless it's an executive appointment. So what we see is most of the women who do run in places such as Bahrain and Kuwait, or in the Emirates, we see that a lot of them have obviously higher incomes. We see that many of them have public sector and business experience, obviously higher education levels, and there's a social media savviness. We especially saw that at the municipal level elections in the Saudi case, right? Obviously, some of the bigger challenges that they face are conservative family codes, limited mobility, the requirement of a chaperone, which again makes it important for you to be social media savvy because you can campaign remotely, which is what a lot of Saudi women did during the municipal elections. There's a short of history of suffrage, so there's a lot to be working toward. There's a lot of groundbreaking that's actually happening in this particular case. Now, I'm actually going to kind of also say that there's a lot of discussion about women's labor force participation being really, really low in the Middle East and North Africa, but the Gulf countries are actually not representative of this. So let me see if I can get this going. So if you actually take a look at this particular slide, most of the time when we think about women's labor force participation in the Gulf, we actually think about it in terms of over total labor force participation. As you all know, there's a demographic abnormality in the Gulf countries, right? So there are more men on the whole, a lot of them are non-nationals, and for all practical purposes, they make labor statistics that are published by the ILO virtually uninterpretable. If you actually start thinking about women's labor force participation as a percentage of the total female population, all of a sudden you see that 50 to 60% of the female labor force, the citizen labor force, is actually participating in the workforce, right? What does that say? That actually means that there are a lot of women who are working. A lot of them are in the professional sector. They're not in manufacturing and agricultural jobs, and it puts them in a position where down the line, if they do choose to run for office, and if the system is more open, they can actually probably more readily do it than some of their counterparts in other countries. So, just to give an illustration of this, we see more women in politics in North Africa, but we see them there due to political parties. And one of the reasons why they need the party to run is because, on average, they make lower incomes, and they're situated in sectors that are lower performing and that they're not necessarily as lucrative as what you see when it comes to women in the GCC states. What about the Levant? In the Levant, we actually see a lot of these women who run as independents, and it's basically an artifact of the situation that we see. We do have parallel systems in place, and we also have gender quotas in some of the countries too. Plus, the standard of living is slightly higher than what we see in North Africa. And we see them using kind of tribal sects and family networks to kind of push themselves into these positions. We see them using NGOs and local, both international, and of course there's personal wealth in the fray as well. Right, so in conclusion, I actually think this is a pretty suggestive line of research, not just for the Middle East and North Africa, but I actually think it's a pretty suggestive line of research for the world as a whole. There are, close to about, I would say, 20 to 30% of the legislatures in the world, in fact, have, women who are independent within their folds. There are a couple of questions you should ask yourself when we talk about this independence. First, what does that mean? Does that mean that they have any kind of independent say when it comes to agenda setting? So in the Jordanian case, the repeal of the rape law that just happened was effectively initiated by some of the independents in the parliament. It's worth asking whether we might see that in the Lebanese case. We know in the Tunisian case that this was certainly forwarded by some of the women in the parliament, but the question is further whether this was something that was party promoted, or whether it was kind of women acting as independent agents. Well, what happens when they actually are independent in the parliament itself? And again, there's the question of what does this translate into when we're talking about women at the local level who are running as independents? Not all women are well-heeled. In fact, quite a few of them in the Jordanian case and in the Omani case are basically kind of teachers. They're what passes for middle or lower class, right? And they relied on their local level social networks. But again, education was always a focal point here. The local level, municipal level elections might be a different story, and that's something worthy of research as well. Finally, I kind of want to leave you with the question of, is the focus on political parties and list PR somewhat antiquated? Now, we've talked a lot about political inclusion here and essentially how to move forward, like what plurality and inclusion means in a changing world and in a changing Middle East. And, you know, up until recently, a lot of the NGOs, the development contractors that were working in the Middle East and North Africa really focused on this idea of strengthening political parties, and that the only ways of accessing political space had to be through political parties. Now my question is, you know, is that sort of outdated? Should we be thinking about other ways that people access political space? And these parallel systems that are coming to the forefront, yes, I know that people will accuse them of, like, you know, kind of privileging patron-client networks, right? But are they part of an evolution that allows for parties and for other interest groups to coexist in space, that allows for other, you know, kind of members of society to be included in them through not just, you know, for instance, the support of the party, but also by running as independents, either through support of like tribe, sect, association, or their own personal wealth. So I leave you with that. Really, my big question is, we really need to be talking about a theory of electoral independence, what it means for agenda setting across the democratic versus non-democratic regimes, right? Most of the time, again, like I said before, we think of pluralism through parties as the representative pluralism. I think that that is not necessarily the mode that's the most likely to succeed in individual countries in the Middle East and North Africa. So are there ways for us to reconceptualize what it means to be independent in this space? Thanks.
Thank you, Bojina. Thanks for getting us started. That was a wealth of information and interesting ways to think about female representation in political systems throughout the Middle East. On to Abdussalam Maghrabi. He is an associate professor of political science at Duke University. He's a core faculty member of Duke's Islamic Studies Center and Middle East Studies Center. His research focuses on the interaction between culture and politics in the context of Arab and Muslim majority countries. His research explores the central role of language as a tool to assert identity, renew authoritarian relations, and claim individual autonomy. He is the author of Liberalism Without Democracy, Nationhood and Citizenship in Egypt, 1922-1936. With that, I'll let him speak.
Okay, thank you, Kadir. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Bozina, for the bright spot. I actually summarized my talk in really nicely, and that is that sometimes we have to keep in mind that political regimes can be forehead of societies at large. That when we talk about the electoral process, about the political institutions, we are going to see an effort to include more women. But the problem is that when we go back to society at large, there is resistance. So that's just something to keep in mind. So over this past 2 days, we really have been talking about the tremendous crisis that is really going on in the Arab world, all the bad things that are going on, and I agree with it. But we are really at a loss as to what exactly behind this crisis and what to do about it. So I'm going to talk about Morocco, but to try to explain the failure of significant political reforms in Morocco, and even the backslide to autocracy. And so in this paper, I basically asked the question, why is it that 10 years, at least 10 years of sustained social movements in Morocco never really reached that breakthrough to make pluralism institutionalized and democracy more progressive? And in order to do this, I use Albert Hirschman's model, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, to try to explain this dynamic in Morocco in the Arab Spring. I don't claim that it can be applied to the rest of the Arab world, and certainly not to cases like Libya, Iraq, Yemen, and Syria. However, I think there is an argument here that I see worth pursuing. So in my 15 minutes or 14 minutes that I have, I will try to make 3 points, basically. I will provide an account of the February 20th movements in Morocco to see what they were really trying to accomplish in terms of reform. And I will talk a little briefly about the reaction of the regime to this pressure from below. Then I will explain why I think Hirschman's model can be very helpful in terms of explaining why the Arab Spring, but also previous other movements, have not really been able to lead to major breakthrough. And third, I'm going to give some kind of preliminary finding from survey I conducted in Morocco among youth around the same period as of the Arab Spring, 2011, 2012. And basically, in a nutshell, the findings suggest that while Moroccan youth really aspire for social justice, while they aspire for certain political rights, they really hold very conservative social views. And this really kind of explain that they are really risk averse. They never want to cross to that exit, what we call the exit, and to go beyond the regime change. So I will make that parallel. So first of all, I mean, I want to establish that the February 20th movement in Morocco was as serious as on the other countries like in Tunisia and Egypt. It's basically, it never called into question the monarchy. It never asked the king to get out of the country, like in Tunisia and Egypt. However, the criticism of the regime was very clear, and it was centered around the monarchy, or the structure of power, the makhzen. I mean, there were slogans in the street. It was very clearly directed about the monarchy's monopoly of economic power, of political power. So there was no question that the monarchy was considered, even though they never really crossed that line of saying, okay, we want to really exit we want a different type of regime. Beyond the kind of slogan targeting the monarchy, as we know you have the power, we know that you are responsible for this, but we are not really pushing you over. There was also the nature of the organization of the February 20th movement was very much similar in terms of demographics, sociological background, organizations, tools to reach out, to organize, were exactly the same as in the other countries like Tunisia and Egypt. The capacity to mobilize, we have some figures that I'm going to go through, but at some point there were like 53 cities were all mobilized with street demonstrations, reaching about 300,000 people, which by Morocco's proportion is fairly, is very big. Not that social movements are unknown in Morocco. There was since independence pretty much. I mean, labor, activism in Morocco is very much well established, but was never this cross-sectorial kind of organized together at one day around some large issue. So it was something new. Another element or characteristics that I think makes Morocco comparable to Tunisia and Egypt in terms of mobilization is that the organizers, the actors behind these movements were completely unknown. So the regime has no way of trying to co-opt them as like political leaders or trade unions. So they are really all new, they have the same. So the challenge was real enough that immediately, like basically 4 or 5 weeks after the first demonstrations, the king addressed the nation and made a major speech in which he said that there will be some constitutional reforms with significant changes, but gender equality, the acceptance of the Amazigh language, the identity in Morocco, the central role of the parliament and political parties. So they were really they seemed like significant concessions, I think, to the social movement at the time. So everybody was ready for this change. By June, however, I mean, the demonstration began in February. In March, the king addressed the nation and promised this constitutional reform. By June, pretty much all disappeared. That the king formed this royal commission, handpicked 19 members. They were independent, but fairly, within the establishment. And they came out with this a very diluted constitution that did not at all live up to the promises of the king in his speech in March. So what happened? I mean, why is it that between March and June, what happened exactly for the regime to change completely its position and get away with it? June, like the king called for the referendum on new constitution, and it was approved by the familiar numbers that we know, 95% for it, and with the so it's basically we can see the beginning of the rollback already, only after 5 months. So in order to understand this dynamic, so I borrowed the Albert Hirschman's model that's called exit, voice, and loyalty. And basically, this is an economic model where in a market, if, for example, consumers of some products or some service are unhappy with the quality of the service, they have two choices. They either to exit individually, I no longer buy certain shoes or computers, or I stay and I make noise in order to improve the product. And in the original formulation, these two were really undermining each other. In the Hirschman's formulation, they were undermining each other. If more people, for example, exit, there will be less to protest or to. I mean, you're basically those who are really aware of the deterioration of the quality of the service or the product. If they leave, those are exactly the people that you need in voice. So the question of exit in competitive markets is inconceivable in economic realm. I mean, but basically, if you don't like certain computers, go and buy another one. If you don't like certain telephones. But once we move to human organization, it's a different story. I mean, once you are part of a family, part of a tribe, part of a state, of a religion, exiting has a stiff penalty. Sometimes excommunication, it could be death. It could be, there are severe consequences. So by adapting this model, I think that this question of whether you stay or you leave. Oh, sorry. Thank you. I think there are different ways of looking at this, that the exit is not necessarily destructive as we saw in the original model. Exits can be used as a threat, for example, to say, hey, look, I mean, if you don't improve things, I'm ready to leave. And imagine now, in the case of Morocco, that the February 28th movement basically took the question of the post-monarchy out of the table. They said, we are not interested in, we are not interested in breaking away with the monarchy. Well, imagine now the type of negotiations that will take place if you go to buy a house and you tell the owner, you are the only house I can buy. I don't have the money to buy another house. And then, of course, she's going to use that information against you. That's exactly what I'm trying to say about why social movements in Morocco never really succeeded to bring about significant political change, is because they never wanted to cross that line to say, well, we can think seriously about a republican Morocco. And here's the question. I mean, the markets in the markets, there are alternatives. If you don't like one computer, there's always another one, a third one, a fourth one. In the case of Morocco or the Arab world, the political alternatives are not so clear. And we see that's what happened in Egypt, and we see that's what happened in Syria and other countries. So in a way, one could interpret the attitude of the Arab Spring movement in Morocco as wise, meaning that we really don't trust what will come and replace the monarchy, because we simply don't know the political alternative. But at the same time, it's a really conflicted economy. If you don't make that leap, you are always going to be stuck in basically insignificant reforms. And that, for me, that continuation has really characterized the social protest movement in Morocco for a while. So I don't really have time. I have some other. Okay, oh yeah. Okay. So why is it that young Moroccans are not willing to cross that line? I mean, the absence of political alternative is clear one. I mean, you don't want to take that risk. But according to a survey I conducted in Morocco among about some 550 Moroccan youth, there is really the main finding is that young Moroccans want political change, they want social justice, but they are unwilling to compromise on some social issues about gender, about autonomy from the family. These are the two of the issues that really stand out. And I'm going to simplify, I'm going to show only one. I have 6 scenarios. And this is the one that is really the most striking, is about gender issues. So basically, I can explain the whole process of the survey, but I'll give you this one. Sorry. Okay, so I give them a scenario. I said, well, there is this young woman who wanted to marry a non-Muslim man against the will of her father. What do you think of her decision? I mean, this is, practically this happens in everyday life, but it's not recognized. A lot of Moroccan women get married with Europeans, especially in France. So as I say the question, what do you think of her choice? Do you agree with her decision to get married? And so loyalty represents the idea that they are against that choice. So 69% is very significant. I mean, it's a little bit, in tension with what you presented. So you can see really progress on one hand, that the government itself can induce some reforms, can increase participation in certain bodies, but the rest of society does not necessarily really follow. And here I'm talking about like very educated, undergraduate students who basically still disagree and maintain these social conservative ideas. So in conclusion, if we are thinking about, policy prescriptions, and even though I really don't like the term either, but policy prescription, I really think that without social change, it's going to be extremely difficult to do political change. That we might increase the quotas of women in the parliament, we can show them to the United Nations, we can show them to Western donors, we can check certain boxes, but if the rest of society, if the laws of the states are not really following, if there's no empowerment, if there's no possibility of pluralism, diversity within society, it's going to be a lot of resistance to whatever, down reforms. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Abdeslam. Next, we have Mazen Hassan. He's an assistant professor of comparative politics at Cairo University and a Carnegie Fellow at Harvard University's Ash Center. He specializes in party systems, electoral systems, new democracies, and experimental political science. His research is involved in several survey-based research projects as well as lab experiments that seek to gauge the political attitudes and behavior of Egyptians after the 2011 revolution. He has co-authored 2 books on the subject, and he has a PhD from Oxford University. Mazen.
Okay, thank you very much. I prefer to stand up because I'm going to point at some figures. Thanks, Bashina, for your presentation, because you basically, our 2 presentations match each other very much. Basically, if you're interested in how women got selected, that was Bajina. If you're interested in what they do after they get elected, this is my presentation. So, yes, and I have, I think I even have some proofs for many of the observations that you've made. So, the motivation for this paper, which basically deals with the behavior of Egyptian female MPs in the current Egyptian parliament, is this. That 2015, as Bajina pointed out, was a trend disruptor when it comes to the representation of women in the Egyptian parliament. Mainly driven by quotas, but in addition to other women who have won majority mandates as well. This is the historical trend of female representation in the Egyptian parliament, and as you can see, it's the first time that we scored 16% in 2015 out of the total number of MPs are women. This is 4 times the historical average. There were some major inroads, and These three, also almost trend disruptors, were also driven by quotas, but this is the highest number we have got. In total, we have 89 MPs, female MPs. 56 of them are elected via closed list, so a quota system. 19 women won majoritarian direct mandates, and in Egypt, if this is the case, it means that they have won a runoff election against a male candidate, which is in most of the Egyptian districts is a very uphill battle. And we have 14 appointed by the president. All in all is 89. So the question basically, I have two questions. The first one is, who are those female MPs? Are we dealing with a new category, new breed of MPs in the Egyptian parliament? Do they differ from the male counterparts or not? And on what grounds? And did this political experiment work? Is there any difference? Did they discuss anything differently? Did they adopt any new changes, any new agenda, etc.? Even if it was driven by a quota, and quotas in Egypt are constitutional quotas, so they're here to stay. But again, and even if some of them are appointed by the president, but there is, any student of institutional literature and political science would be familiar with the law of unintended consequences. You enshrine a rule, but then there is a chain reaction that then follows, and many consequences emerge that were not initially envisioned by those who put them into force. So I'm not going to go in details when it comes to theory, but there are a lot of theories about representation. Some of them general political representation, some of them pertaining to women. The historical literature basically distinguishes between different types of representation, delegate or trustee. This is basically whether MPs would be elected. They would then face a trade-off between adopting their own agenda or following specifically the demands made by the constituents. Women or female MPs in Egypt were not solely elected by women voters, but if they continue to adopt a predominantly feminist agenda, that's an indication of the delegate theory. Again, descriptive and substantive representation, this basically means that in order to represent a certain social group, you have to come from this certain social group. So women are best represented by women and not vice versa. Again, there is a trade-off, there is a disagreement in the literature, but these are competing theories. There are theories about the critical mass. So once representation of a certain social group passes a certain threshold, then things start to differ. Some put this at 10, some put this at 15. In Egypt at 16, so we have bypassed this. And this is a picture of them. As you can see, they even sit mostly close to each other in the Egyptian parliament, although they belong to different parties. Some of them are elected, some of them are appointed, but they usually find a familiarity with each other, of course, preferring to sit side by side. Again, when it comes to specifically female representation, we have theories saying that maybe female MPs who are elected by a quota system, because they know they have been elected to represent women, they would act as the frontline troops in the fight for women's rights. Because they know that this is the role that they should fulfill, they live up to this role. Of course, there is a lot of body of literature on, or proving actually, by analyzing how female MPs have behaved, even in Western democracies, that they tend to transfer their social roles outside Parliament, inside Parliament, or that they tend to adopt inside Parliament topics that are very much relevant to their interests outside Parliament, which are mainly women's rights, what are called soft issues, so healthcare, education, etc. And they tend also to address the grievances that are faced by women or that women have outside Parliament. And in Egypt, there are many of those. For example, this is just results. These are results of recent survey, the Demographic and Health Survey in Egypt. 87% of Egyptian men and 76 of women believe that the woman's most basic role is to take care of the home and cook for the family. 50% of men doubt that women can effectively combine roles of politicians and homemakers. 98% of men and 85% of women agree that changing diapers, giving baths to children, and feeding children should all be the mother's responsibility. And only 13% of women and 13% of men and 37% of women agree that women can be head of state. We'll see how female MPs manage to, or at least try to address some of these grievances afterwards. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into detail with this, but this is basically the pressures exerted upon female MPs in Egypt. Any MP would have to represent some voters, so district representation. If he or she belongs to a party, they would have to represent party. If you are in a restricted political environment, you also have to align your attitudes with the regime line. And if you are a woman, you also have the additional task of representing women issues. So all this is mixed up in how women behave and speak in parliament. So what did I do? So basically, I'm comparing the background characteristics of females to male MPs, and I've analyzed the parliamentary scripts of some selected sessions in Egyptian parliament to see how they spoke. When it comes to backgrounds, age, and this is a confirmation, I think, of what you've said, they are much more, or they are much younger female MPs than male MPs. On average, they are 45 years old. All MPs on average are 50. The youngest MP is a female in the Egyptian parliament who is 25 years old. When it comes to education, there isn't such a huge difference. They are slightly higher on scale when it comes to PhDs, but as we're going to see, the differences are not statistically significant. They are more or less in line with other male MPs. So the same distribution almost holds. When it comes to party affiliation, many of them, the majority of them, run as independents. Again, this is more of basically an evidence of how weak Egyptian political parties are. But there isn't a huge difference between them and the overall statistic. So 77% of them are females. The division of party affiliation does not differ hugely. Maybe the major difference, which is a shame for Ulwafd Party, for those of you who know Ulwafd Party, this is the traditionally liberal party of Egypt. It doesn't have a single female MP. When it comes to employment, the only data I could get is basically whether they're employed by the government or the private sector. They are more likely to be employed by the government because, they are more likely to come from a government sector because they're more likely to be employed by the government, anyhow, because the private sector usually is seen as more competitive for women to be employed in. Again, this is just to test statistically the significance. It's a mix of chi-square and t-tests depending on the dependent variable. But basically, we only have two main statistically significant results. Quotas matter. So remove the quotas, the overall representation of female MPs will go down again. So female MPs are significantly more likely to be elected by quotas, and they're significantly younger. But there are no significant differences when it comes to employment and education. Now to the second question, which is basically the more interesting one, their agenda. I was mainly interested in finding out whether there are any differences between male and female MPs when it comes to debate participation. There are mixed results in the literature about this. Some notice an increase in the rate of participation by female MPs in some countries, but which rapidly decreases and then goes back to the normal rate, basically, with no significant differences between males and females. Sorry? And what topics or what issues they focus on. Are they more likely to support the government, more likely to criticize the government? Are they less likely to go into technical details of bills? Are they more or less likely to go into the tough issues of national security, etc.? And to do this, I have made a content, or I've done a content analysis of parliamentary scripts, as you've seen. The parliamentary scripts of the Egyptian Parliament maintains a very detailed parliamentary script of all of its sessions, and they're in the public domain. You probably don't see it here, but even the interruptions are recorded very thoroughly. So here someone is interrupting and shouting, and all this is recorded. So even and even the jokes are recorded in much detail. So I have chosen 5 topics just to represent a diverse set of topics, and also the salient ones: an economic topic, which is the discussion of the budget bill 2016-17, a women-specific topic, which is an FGM bill, or bill criminalizing FGM, a civil rights topic, which is the NGOs law, which is a highly restrictive bill, was very controversial, and the political oversight bill, which is a questioning of a minister over wheat, the system of buying wheat from farmers, storing wheat, and reselling it. The coding was done by hand, and the unit of analysis was the paragraph. So not the sentence, or not the words, but the paragraph. This is just the descriptive statistics of what was done, the general picture. All in all, the number of paragraphs analyzed were 741. I cannot imagine I read all those pages, but it did happen. And the total number of MPs was 184. And as you can see, people spoke, or MPs spoke more on the budget bill rather than any other bill, and then the NGOs law. And this is the rate of participation, broken down into male or female MPs. Remember, 16% is the number of female MPs in Parliament. As you can see, they spoke. The topic they spoke most on was the FGM bill, which is 20% of the interventions were by female MPs over the paragraphs, and then the NGOs law, and they spoke the least about the political oversight topic, which is wheat storage. Okay, so just what they did. Again, I've coded. Sorry, this is the coding that I've done. There's no time to go into details, but basically, these are the categories of the budget discussions, whether they talked about the deficit, healthcare, employment, subsidies, regional issues, whether they were for or against the government. And this is the result. Female are, I think, yellow, and male MPs are in green. All in all, the criticism of the government by MPs was the highest category to be tackled. But what's interesting is that female chose to speak about healthcare the most, and followed by education, and then the deficit and welfare. Women issues, it's actually, it's 0 point something, but were only talked about by female MPs, not by male MPs, and this is why you don't see green here. These are just quotes from the female MPs, for example, talking about, this is an intervention about healthcare funds for medicine is 600 million. It's the same as it was in previous year, which is not sufficient. How it becomes sufficient this year. And this is a criticism of the government. What happened, she was referring to the leak of high school exams should cause the resignation of the government. Again, this is a criticism of the government. If you analyze this statistically, you would see that basically female MPs were significantly more likely to speak on healthcare and women issues compared to men. and less likely to support the government compared to men. This is supported by the literature. This is a little bit interesting. If we have time, I will get back to this. When it comes to women issues, again, these are the topics that were coded, what they are against, FGM, the FGM practice with it, whether you apply, what type of arguments would you apply when you argue against FGM? A religious argument, a feminist argument, a scientific, which is a medical argument. Are you for toughening sentences or not for those who conduct the practice? Are you against doctors, etc.? And this is how it is. Most of the MPs or most of the paragraphs were basically against FGM. There were some people who were with FGM. All of them are male, not female MPs. And when female MPs spoke, they basically concentrated on talking against FGM or employing a feminist argument against it. And this is, I know Miriam talked about this yesterday, but this is interesting. This is an MP, and she's a religious scholar. She has a PhD degree from Al-Azhar as well. And she's not the kind of person you would want to mess with. I mean, because she do not go into much detail with her on a practice based on religious argument, because she has the religious argument, and she's strongly against FGM, and she's the one basically who led the fight. So these are many of the interventions that she said: respect women, stop constraining, intimidating, or hurting us. It is unfairly connected to Islam, etc. I will jump quickly to the statistical analysis, which basically says that female MPs are more likely to use feminist arguments, and they're more likely to blame doctors than male MPs. Maybe because, yes, how many more minutes I have? Okay, I will now, maybe this is the last slide that I will show, or the last topic, which is a civil rights topic, which is the NGOs bill again. These are basically the categories in which the paragraphs or the discussions were divided or broken down into. I don't know why it keeps doing this, sorry. This is interesting because women were actually as likely as men to agree that certain liberties should be restricted in the sake of national security. That women were as likely as men. There are no statistical differences between women and men when it comes to saying that national security is a pretext for restricting civil liberties. And these are very good quotes. For example, this one: where is the right of our country to preserve its national security? We know well that the foreign funding and financing of NGOs deviated from its path, particularly in the last 5 years. It has been either hijacked, used for terrorist purposes. And the statistical analysis supports this, which is basically no significant differences. I don't have time to go through this, sorry, but the main conclusions basically are that, well, women representation still very much significantly linked to lists. There is evidence that they focus more on soft issues, as the literature calls them, which are healthcare, education, and women's rights. Thanks a lot, and sorry for being.
Thank you, Mazen. Last but certainly not least, we have Imad Salameh. He's an associate professor of political science and international affairs at Lebanese American University and the director of the Institute for Social Justice and Conflict Resolution there. He's also the president of the Center for Arab Research and Development. He serves on the Atlantic Council's Task Force on Religion, Identity, and Counter-Extremism. Imad is the author of various books. Two of them are The Decline of Nation-States After the Arab Spring, The Rise of Communitocracy, and secondly, The Government and Politics of Lebanon. His research broadly examines ethnic and sectarian polarization and transnational extremism in the MENA countries. Imad?
Thank you, Kadir. Thank you for the Baker Institute for making this opportunity possible to speak about this very critical and important topic. of building pluralistic, inclusive states in a post-Arab Spring, particularly that this topic is really the question of the day, given the high level of polarization and communitarian conflict sweeping the region. And the question of what state to be established and formed is a big question. So I promise not to bring you any more figures or graphs or statistics, but maybe focus more on pictures in my presentation, just to change the pace here. Really, the question that I like to address, and really here I'm also presenting more of a descriptive and characterizing the situation in the region rather than I'm giving any kind of ideological perspective of my own, is the question that I like to address is whether the Arab nation state, the way we have known them throughout post-independent period, remain viable entities. And if they're no longer viable entities to manage politics the way we have known it, why, first of all, they are no longer viable? And then what could the possibility of alternative governing forms emerge in the region given the facts on the ground? So to answer that question, one can first look at the region nowadays to note quickly that in the past 7 years, almost 5 Arab presidents were overthrown in a region that have been accustomed to see presidents serve life terms and sometimes succeeded by their family members. At least 7 new constitutions formed, many more amended, 20 new governments established, almost 15 new prime ministers inaugurated. Really massive changes, politically speaking, have been taking place in the region, unprecedented throughout post-independent state. At the same time, severe turmoil happening, violence, 20 major cities have been destroyed, big ones such as Aleppo, Homs, and others in Syria and Iraq, Mosul. Almost 500,000 people killed, 1.5 million injured, almost 15 million displaced internally and externally, mostly in Syria, but definitely we see that also in Iraq and in Yemen and Libya and Sudan. And of course, we've been seeing and witnessing rising sectarian, tribal, ethnic transfer and cleansing. I mean, you just look at Syria today. Syria today is nothing like, in terms of demographic, a presence of different communities, no longer the same 7 years ago. Different sectarian composition have really changed the composition of Syrian cities and towns. So the first observation to note regarding post-Arab Spring conflicts and changes is to note that most of these radical transformations and radical changes have taken place in mostly Arab nationalist republics: Syria, Iraq, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, Sudan. And the question thus whether these Arab national republics formed after independence are really viable entities to govern these diversities, and whether we have to think about alternative options. So, but the question of legitimacy of these states is not new, though, despite the fact post-Arab Spring have brought to the surface the legitimacy issue. The legitimacy question of these states have bombarded or have haunted them for some times. Throughout independence, Arab nationalists claimed all the problems on, fragmentations of the Arabs into different mini-states, or being under the influence of colonial empires or post-colonial states as well. The Sykes-Picot Agreement typically comes to mind. It is responsible for the fragmentations, colonialism, and so forth. And post-Arab Spring, legitimacy crisis really transformed into the question of whether states are really representative of their various communities, and the exclusions of communities, whether these communities are sectarian, tribal, or regional, become the really question of state sustainability and presence. So if we look a bit into political theory and try to fetch out the question of what make a legitimate state. I know previous panel were discussing, Nadim just arrived, but he was talking about, what makes a legitimate state. God knows what, every time we think about this question, something different comes to mind. But in terms of political theory, at least one can say that we can rely a bit on political thinkers, such as classical thinkers, such as Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, were both presented to us what make a state legitimate, or a state sovereignty legitimate. State and both realist, if we're talking about Hobbes, or liberal, if we're talking about Locke, consider that state must provide for its own inhabitants economic security and cultural protectionism, without which, the state seek to be legitimate. Of course, from a Hobbesian perspective, authoritarian states are more legitimate because they provide better security, while liberal state, weak government, and so forth provide less security. From a Lockean perspective, liberalism is important to build a representative government and make state more representative and sustainable. Along the liberal viewpoints, and given that Arab states have been for so long Hobbesians, many efforts have been made through some theories of change and transitionalism to inject various liberal reforms in order to transform these Hobbesian states into liberal states. So some of these reforms came with, development agencies, international development agency, international aids. Some of them have been focused on giving funds to development projects, economic education, social cohesion, efficient government. Others to open power and make it accessible to various groups. Others have focused on providing cultural transformation, such as gender equity, giving more way for secularism and human rights in governments, hoping that eventually these Hobbesian states will become liberal. We know that after the Arab Spring, none of these interventions have really succeeded. And Hobbesianism, in various ways, have been preserved in most Arab states, and or they've been challenged by communitarian by communitarian movements. Why these states, nation states, have lost power and have not been able to liberalize the way we've thought they would? Perhaps because globalization. This is something that in my paper, I emphasize. Globalization really, as we all know today, really undermine the ability of state to function the way it functions, in post-independent states. Neither the state is capable to maintain grip on its security, nor its, economic activities, nor, have full preservation of national culture. We all know now that the world is pretty open. economic products move back and forth across borders. What happened in one state implicate what happened in another. Transnational military movements and moving around. Culture is pretty much becoming globalized with the presence of, mobile phones and internet technology, information, and so forth. And all that will really undermine the ability of national state to function the way traditionally it has functioned throughout post-independent periods in the Middle East. So, given the fact that the state is not able to really make its presence felt, we have been seeing the rise of various communitarian groups to take over the traditional functions given to the state. So, for instance, if you look at some of these economic, now here we're bringing some figures just to stay along the rhythm. If we look at the economic evidence of globalization and their implication on Arab nation states, you see, for instance, in 2001 to 2005, the trade balance of agricultural product in Arab countries were pretty much balanced out between import and export. But moving on from 2000 to 2008, the balance has really shifted in favor of import, given imported product to Arab states 78% to 22%. What does that mean? That means agricultural sector in the Middle East is really implicated, devastated by globalization. The nation state has not been able to preserve the economic well-being of its own people. Looking at Syria, for instance, this is also trade balance taken from World Bank data. It has been tremendous, the decline of, the trade balance from sometimes 2001 to 2012. Give you another idea in Syria, this is really emerging big. If you look at the trade balance along other countries, the only positive curve you see there are those of oil-producing countries, while all those going downward curves are for states that have been implicated by the Arab Springs, and they're primarily non-oil-producing countries. So, given the fact that states are no longer capable of performing its traditional function, we have seen the increasing rise of communitarian movements, relying sometimes on primordial means of governance, taking over traditional function, having networks. Sometimes these networks have been transnational and defying traditional state-to-state relationship. I attribute this rise of communitarianism in the midst of globalization to something called the double movement. It is a phenomenon that Carl Polanyi in 1944 advanced and advocated to describe the rise of predatory liberal economy confronted by own protection groups within the state. So now I think it is going more global. To demonstrate the power of transnational communitarian groups, here is a photo taken in Pakistan. People demonstrating in protest of Saudi government, passing sentence against Sheikh Nimr for his execution, and being confronted by the nationalist army in Pakistan. Here, another photo that's showing, these are symbolic things. Here, showing the fallout of Saddam Hussein's status in Iraq, watched by American soldier. But look behind the status is a mosque is standing. So that tells you that, these nationalist movements kind of, symbolically falling out while communitarianism on the rise. We can give a lot of examples from Hezbollah's operations within a Shiite community, how it is being transnationalist and taken over variety of functions traditionally given to the state, to Sunni Salafist societies. from economic, security, and even cultural functions. If you survey all the political movements, particularly military non-state actors in the Middle East, you're going to find them there are predominantly communitarian. You're not going to see neither a socialist nor a liberal democratic movements emerging, nor secular movements. So they're primarily communitarian. And so are the political parties. This is a table showing in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, most political parties emerging are pretty much communitarian. Given the fact that most actors on the ground are communitarians, what kind of states can emerge out of these forces? It is difficult to say that these forces will bring about a democratic state. Most likely, given in a coming decade or so, these political groups will formulate a communitarian regimes. Now, these regimes can be exclusive or can be inclusive. Exclusive types can be seen like, with this map where the New York Times printed a few years ago showing potential divisions of Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon into different Shia, Sunni, and Alawi states. These are potential exclusionary communitarian options. Also in Yemen could be divided between northern Zaidi and southern Sunni states. However, exclusionary states are difficult to come about. Why? Because it's difficult to establish demographic purity. It's difficult to have neighborly relationship via transits or cross-border relations, water outlets, routes, integration in the international system. All these pose difficulties for any exclusionary communitarian states to function. And given these few maps to show sectarian distribution in the region, this is in Iraq. You cannot see in Iraq itself really a solid demographic communitarian purity. In Lebanon, it is pretty, mixed. Looking at Syria, also sectarian communitarian compositions, pretty mixed. Lebanon and Syria. In Yemen, if we look at Yemen, these are tribal distributions. It's practically impossible to have exclusionary communitarianism. If you look at the region as a whole, the picture is pretty, rainbow. It is really kind of impossible to have an exclusionary state. Now, there is a possibility of, alternatively, a consociational. You could always resort in term of communitarian system into a federal option, but also you could have a consociational option. A consociational option, this is, type like Lebanon. Consociational option rely on various important functions: the establishment of grand coalition, mutual veto, segmental autonomy, and proportional representation. To have a consociationalism, government must be established large. Each group within a community must have some form of veto power. Each will have to have some kind of autonomy over cultural and educational issues, and some kind of representation that is proportional. Okay, why consociational governance is more viable than exclusionary communitarianism is due to the fact that you don't have to divide along geographic lines. Okay, you could have instead communities can share power rather than be divided along geographic lines. So the Lebanese consociational models is not a perfect model, of course, but it has provided some good answers to the question of diversity and plurality, preserving groups and communities where no other surrounding states have been able to do. This is not, like I said, a perfect system. It has many faults, but it has been pretty good in expressing inclusionary politics in state conduct. We still need to conduct important research to expand on what form of communitarian pluralism to be established and have it more functional and stable. And perhaps, we need to look at electoral systems that can strengthen the cohesion across communities. These things need to be further examined and researched, perhaps in comparative perspective. That's all what I have to say. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Imad. Now we can have some questions from the audience.
Thank you. Since we are now writing about women in Lebanese elections, the first presentation was particularly interesting, but my question, forgive me, goes to the Egyptian model. You mentioned, Dr. Mazen, the critical mass theory as far as women's participation. Did you have evidence, very clear evidence, showing that this critical mass was actually likely to change or able to change political work in Egypt? And a question to Dr. Salameh about the veto notion of the consocial system in Lebanon. Is it not this veto that has been blamed quite strongly for the lack of decision-making versus Swiss model of need to negotiate and find compromise? So how would a model for the region work when everybody can block everyone else at all times? Sorry, thank you.
Go ahead, please, if you want to answer. Anyone?
Oh, yeah, okay. Thank you for the question. Statistically, I do not have the evidence because I haven't analyzed scripts in previous parliaments where this high number did not exist. But those who have done the same thing in some European countries did find the evidence for such a thing. But one thing I can say, which is that now it's getting really difficult for male MPs to say anything that seems remotely restrictive of women's rights. So this is something I can sense, even without running any statistical analysis. The FGM bill, for example, was introduced just because one male MP said that all Egyptian women should be circumcised. And then there was this huge backlash, and then one female introduced that bill. It was immediately supported by the others, and he had to apologize in public and in parliament. So this is at least one, I think, strong evidence for this.
Excellent question, really, because we suffer from this issue of veto power, where, like in Lebanon, and, this brings us to the current controversy, that we had between foreign minister and a speaker of the House, where the speaker of the House was accused by the foreign minister of having the power to close down the parliament anytime he chooses to, and acting on behalf of the Shiite community. That's a form of veto power that the Shiite in Lebanon do hold. The Sunnis can resign, the prime minister can resign, cannot sign bills. I mean, the bill is another question that we are confronting here. Veto power is very difficult to overcome. And veto power in Lebanon in particular something that hinders the efficiency and effectiveness of government taking decisions. However, veto power is important because it provides groups with the ability to protect itself and preserve itself from the tyranny of others. I mean, without the veto power, there could be decisions taken that undermine one community, and that can lead to really grave consequences. And therefore, it has, despite its disadvantages, veto power has in many ways provided a safe valve, so to speak, to different communities, especially smaller ones. And consequently, it has, loosened out the tension, because, now you're a community with a veto power. Your rights cannot be easily taken, and therefore, this is, in many ways, provides for pluralism and diversity in a state. So, in that sense, so it has negatives and positives. But overall, given the difficulties and the complexities of the country and the sectarian tensions and dynamic, it has provided more positivisms than negativisms, I would say.
Other questions?
My students, well, gotta ask. Extra points for questions.